Gene, okay, awesome. Thank you. Much appreciated. Welcome. So Jing, I think you're the only new person today. Welcome to you. This is presumably the last or second to last time we're actually going to be discussing this book. So you kind of got in at the very end. I apologize if this seems somewhat incomprehensible to you, but I really appreciate your trying to see where we're at. We are using this book as a springboard to actually begin reading some Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus in the coming months. This was kind of a preparatory course in reading the Greeks. And so we will be applying the lessons that we've acquired from this Schmidt book to the future readings. But yeah, that shouldn't, if you're interested in pursuing that with us later, it shouldn't get in the way too much of your understanding what our conversations are all about.
Yeah, I'm very interested in Greek philosophy, so just see, I check it out. So,
well, yeah. Well, that's great taste. I praise you for good taste, and secondly, I think we're a really, really good group for starting to get our arms around Greek philosophy, because we've done a year-long detour and just preparing to do that. So our seriousness is almost without equal. All right.
I think you should go.
Yeah. Okay. So just so we have the words kind of chiming in the back of our minds, would you mind reading some of the those sections from the introduction of the book that really set forth the thesis of the book, and then we'll see how that plays out here at the very end of the book.
Okay. So from the beginning, what we've been talking about is two different philosophies, which was Aristotle and Plato, and modernism. And this part of the book outlines the central error or beginning of the modernist viewpoint. So I'll start to read. Okay, for Aristotle, there was a big difference between simply taking in an object present to us in experience as a totality, something perception too is capable of doing, and distinguishing between the elements belonging specifically to it and conceptually grasping them in a single act as a unity, after having examined how they belong together in the same object. Only the intellect is capable of the latter step. Seeing a circle seems to be a simple matter of cognition. However, in order to be able to distinguish what part of the whole we perceive is actually a circle, one needs a criterion for selection. This criterion justifies us in saying that the chalk, the white color, the specific size, etc., which we see in relation to the circle before us, do not actually belong to it qua circle. Rather, this figure is a circle only insofar as it possesses certain characteristics. It has a uniform, closed, round form. All distances from the perimeter to the center are equal, etc. According to Aristotle, one can only know this through conceptual analysis. Since perception cannot itself perform such an analysis, it must be guided by this analysis. Perception always sees a whole comprised of characteristics that belong to the concept, round, uniform, etc., and others foreign to it, white, chalk, etc. It just brings them together in one totality. Following Aristotle, one can thus distinguish between two ways of establishing unity in one's knowledge. One can rely on perception, in which case the unifying band is the object as a whole, as it's present to perception, the well-determined object. But one can also rely on ratio, in which case the unifying band is the objective unity. And this is only grasped by the concept. This concept of concept will be the main object of the following investigation. The solution to the Scotus proposed amounts to a leveling of distinction between two different forms of knowledge of unity. He only distinguishes between knowledge that looks at the whole and knowledge that distinguishes the individual parts of things. However, he no longer pays attention to or no longer considers relevant the fact that such a record or concept of the whole can in turn be of two completely different types. One, it can either be the simple concept of a whole, whose parts one does not yet know and which one perceives merely as a confused mass in itself, or it can be the rationally grounded combination of the knowledge of the parts to a whole. Consequently, Duns Scotus is left with only two distinct intellectual capacities: the concept of the whole, which is assigned to a combined act of perception and the intellect, and analytical reason, which distinguishes the parts. In place of perception, reason, and intellect, that is, instead of at least three ways of acquiring knowledge, he now has only two: intuition, which now appears to be intelligent in itself, and reason. Thus, we are left with a dichotomous schema, that is, with an either or, either simple or differentiating, either the whole of intuition, of feeling, or the parts of thinking, which is now merely discursive. Okay, I don't know if I want to go any
Awesome.
further, but I just really thought that is the heart. That's representational thinking versus
Right.
it's all there. If we could only see it when we first read the introduction. Go for it, Michael.
Pardon me?
Go ahead. I don't know if I need to read further unless group.
Oh, no. I think that's good. I think that brings some of the fundamental points together. I mean, maybe one thing I did want to bring out a little bit more clearly than Schmidt did, and that is that.
Well, I want to say one more thing.
Yeah, please.
So what happens when Duns Scotus did this is Aristotle would say there's no perception without cognition. There's no perception without the intellect. Whereas Duns Scotus and the moderns, perception is this magical black box processor which takes the outside world and just boom, gives it to you in totem. So perception doesn't involve thinking, and that's why you have the conscious and the unconscious. This is such a huge difference. It affects everything. Whereas Aristotle and Plato would say the perception is no black box. There's no perception without cognition. There's no perception without intellect. You can't, and we have gone over this distinction again and again, but it's this distinction, this overloading of perception with all these magical powers that has caused all the errors that modernity keeps having. Okay, I'm done now. Sorry.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was nice. A nice packaging of the basic thesis and how challenging it is to our basic habits of thought, the habits of thought that all of us bring to any philosophical work we happen to peruse. We are thinking, and we're thinking about that philosophical work, and what we're using to think about that philosophical work is usually thoughts that reflect this understanding of what thought is as representation. So we're representing another philosopher's representations of something else. And this is a terrible, and this allows for proliferation of infinitely many interpretations, because none of them can be shown to be any better than any other. And so we get into fractal modernity, where where everything fragments.
Well, I think what I just heard you said is that this overloading perception, then we have, I have perception that's different from your perception. And since perception doesn't have intellect or conceptual thinking involved in it, it's just this thing that's attached to our souls or our brains or minds or something, then your perception is different from my perception. And all of a sudden we have relativity. I think that's what you're doing, right? And then we have relativity, and then we have the end of knowledge. Knowledge is now agreement, opinion.
So is there
belief?
Is there part in this book, no, I wasn't here for 95% of it. Is there part of this book where he talks about where exactly that happened in history and why?
Yeah, basically the pages where Bo was reading.
Yep, page 25, 24, the introduction. He's
describing what happened in terms of the difference between modern thought and Greek thought, but did he have any speculation on how it happened or why, when it happened rather?
The rest of these pages go through how they misunderstood Aristotle's argument.
Oh, okay.
And so that's what the rest of this chapter past 24 goes.
Yeah, Duns Scotus is a villain.
Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, and this transition is in the 14th century, and he makes some minor So he dedicates a couple pages to it, but it's not an extensive thesis. What he wants to show is, is how different Scotus and Occam were talking about knowledge than the ancient Greeks. And he does make the claim that prior to them, the great philosophers did not speak this way. So he doesn't speculate as to so much as to why Scotus and Occam changed the paradigm of knowledge. And he doesn't speculate very much about, or he doesn't do any historical theses about why this way of thinking caught on from the 14th and 15th century on into modernity. He doesn't, that's a rocky road to go. There's a very complex historical thesis. What he's noticing is that the discourse on knowledge changes, and the way in which knowledge is conceptualized is fundamentally according to a representational model based on perception, rather than a conceptual model based on discrimination.
Right.
And so that sets up, so to speak, these ideal types that he then employs throughout this book to show the various differences between these different ways of thinking knowledge and the effects that each one of them has morally, politically, economically, socially, and aesthetically.
Thanks.
And this book is really, really just gives you a panorama of examples for how modernity, by basing itself on a representational model, finds itself in many dead ends of thought. And so what happens in a dead end is we just decisionistically, based on how things appear to us, we just decide how things really are, right? And so getting out of the modern trap has just been an act of faith. We have a Kierkegaardian leap of faith all over the place in all our cognitive activities. And there's nothing rational about a leap of faith. And there's nothing about a leap of faith that'll help you understand the nature of the things you're talking about, right? What you're doing is you're taking a leap of faith to a particular interpretation, and that allows you to dogmatically ignore all the other interpretation because it's my faith.
Right. Well, it just kind of sounds like it has a lot to do with romanticism.
It doesn't. Romanticism is definitely an outgrowth, but it's the 14th century, and we can talk about this in the after chat. But it's mostly theologically motivated. So I have done a little bit of work in trying to figure this out, and I'm happy to talk about it at the end. But yeah, it's a super interesting question, and it's definitely worth pursuing.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing about that. It seems to be like less important why as it is how in this respect, because we're primarily interested in how things got to be that they were, not really pointing fingers of like, well, Duns Scotus said something stupid in the Middle Ages and now we've had 500 years of staring at our toes or something like that. It's there might have been some intentional ways that the thought was shaped, and then there might have been less intentional ways that it's shaped. The point Schmidt, I think, is trying to make is we ended up here. How did we get here? How do we get ourselves out of here back to maybe a little bit more productive use of our time?
Right. There we go.
Nice, Kelly. That was
Thanks.
great, Kelly.
and this really, this book could actually be called A Preface to Plato. Right? It's just a preface. It's just, it doesn't replace Plato. He hardly talks about, he almost never talks about ideas or any of the things that we're used to hearing with respect to Plato. He hardly even brushes up against that. So this certainly isn't meant to spell out the entire Platonic, Aristotelian, systematic conception of knowledge and what follows from it for morality, for our conception about our emotional lives, for politics and the economy. He just gives us, draws out certain consequences of the Greek conception of knowledge and shows very generally how that played out in the way in which they thought these practical dimensions in the classical sense, practical meaning having to do with morality and politics and the economy. So this whole is just a springboard to these guys, and not a replacement for them. So I totally agree with everything that Kelly and Bo said. I think that was very, very well put.
Yeah, and it's been a great journey. I'm so had fun going through this with
Oh, it's
everybody.
not over yet.
I know.
Let's go to 534.
I would also say this isn't quite a defense of Greek philosophy in the sense that he doesn't really go over too many attacks on Greek philosophy. More, he just looks at the difference between the way the Greeks looked at the world and the way we look at the world. But he does at times point out things in modern society or in modern thinking that are manifestly wrong according to the way the Greeks thought.
Right.
So, yeah.
You know, yeah.
They
Oh,
also,
Yeah, I do understand. I really don't. There's a little relativism. That's your. That's a modern thing that happened in what you just said, Garth. And it might not be your intention, but this relativism crept in there. That was, oh, the Greeks have a way of looking at things, and we have a way of looking at things, right? And in that sense, each are optional, right? We can take ours. We can take the Greeks. Well, maybe it's my personal decision about, it's my leap of faith. Maybe I'll look at how the Greeks, right? And I think that the book is saying that's actually not the situation you're ever in. It's not a Greek outlook is over against an Arab outlook, is over against a Danish outlook. It's not kind of a national, historical, or cultural relativism. So it's stricter than that. And what I would want to say is that the Greeks discovered how to think about thought, and thereby, by thinking about thought, they comprehended what unity is. And through comprehending unity, they understood what being is. And they understood how to begin thinking the being of things. Now, the being of things is, of all things, including the human being, is the focus of Greek philosophy. That focus got lost in the Middle Ages, and modernity rebelled against the Middle Age conception, a theocentric conception of what knowledge is. And modernity can be loosely characterized as a practical, hands-on, gaining power over things, and it has nothing to do with grasping the being of things. And so, insofar as all knowledge is oriented towards the being of things, the Greeks gave us the paradigm for thinking the being of things, and modernity gives us the paradigm of how to think about things in order to control them, to control your environment, to control other people, to extend your domain of power. So power is modernity's key, being is the Greeks' key. And that's not just two different ways of looking at the world. One looks at the world as world because it's interested in the being of things. And the other one looks at the world as raw material for manipulation and
Narratives, narratives, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's right. Exactly. And then we tell pretty stories called narratives.
I want to add.
I really do think there is something to the Greek, just as the Greeks discovered geometry through pure thinking, they didn't discover Greek geometry as opposed to Arab geometry or, German geometry. There aren't nationally relative geometries. There's just geometry. So too, the Greeks discovered philosophy and how one has to think if you're going to think the being of things. And there's no national relativity to thinking the being of things.
Well, even though this process works, we haven't established that it's unique. So I don't think that I'm technically wrong in saying the Greek way of thinking. I'm not saying that both ways of thinking are correct. I'm simply saying that according to this way of thinking, these are problematic or contradictory results from our modern point of view. Like these things that we think in modern times are just plainly contradictory. I
think
accept that, but I don't accept that the way of Greek thinking is unique just at least according to what Schmidt has argued here.
All right. Well,
Can
stick
I?
with us. I'll show you.
Tyler's turn. Go ahead, Tyler.
I think what's going on is Schmidt is not only saying that according to the Greeks, modernity has these problems. What he's saying is that modernity itself, the way it thinks, funnels it into its very own problems, because that way of thinking sort of undermines itself.
Yeah.
It produces its own contradictions and confusions that are going to persist in it as long as it continues to presuppose certain things unreflectively the way that the Greeks don't.
Wow, Tyler, that was really good.
So that's the
But point taken. I get what you're saying, Garth. I just there's a use of language that the Greek way is just
I mean, that's what the
put
Gerson
them all on the same playing field, and
Yeah, that is what the Gerson book is. I love the Gerson book. That's usually when I start getting inscrutable, though, according to Peter.
Okay. We'll let you digest it more then.
And I just want to add another thing that, and we have to realize that Plato and Aristotle lived in a post-truth world, and it was called sophistry. And the Peloponnesian War. So what's really fascinating from a historical standpoint is the post-truth world we live in today that we think is, our particular disease occurred to Plato and Aristotle, and they were dead set against living in that kind of world. They wanted to end it. They wanted reality. They wanted distinctions. They wanted truth. They didn't want opinion and moving the crowd and demagoguery, which they saw as the sophists. And that was their enemy. They didn't want that. And I think if they were alive, they would look at us and go, you moderns just messed it all up. You're right back where we tried to get away from. Anyways, I'm done with my stuff. Let's get back to work. Sorry.
All right. Thanks very much, guys and gals. Let's look at 534 and just. I think 534 is particularly telling. It's short, but I think it's helpful. It's called the criteria for the cognition of empirical objects: integrity, totality, and non-falsity of perceptual properties versus conceptual comprehension of what a thing is capable of and what function it serves. So if somebody wouldn't mind reading just this whole section. Let's just get it all in. Anybody feel like reading?
I suppose I can.
Awesome, thanks.
The mental representation of an object can only correspond to the object when it produces it in representation as a whole, completely and unfalsified, without any alteration.
So just a sec, Tyler, can somebody throw the text up on the screen?
I have it on the screen, on my
Okay,
screen.
my bad. Okay, thank you very much. Now, yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't have it. Thanks. Go ahead, Tyler. Thank you.
Okay. All these conditions are held, for good reasons, to be unrealizable. Every clarification of a supposedly originally given object, whether an object of perception, sensation, feeling, etc., necessarily analyzes and recombines this whole within consciousness. In this process, however, the given object is subjected to the operations of representation, etc., in consciousness and thus transformed. Further, no finite thinking can ever fully recreate that original wholeness and completeness, all the neurons and their configurations in a brain, etc. The represented object is therefore always a construct that has come about through a subjective selection and combination.
Yeah, let's just stop there just for a second. I'd just like to rehearse that very briefly. I mean, what's he saying there? And let's use some modern language to make it familiar, because this is basically how we all think, more or less. And yeah, so go ahead. What do you think about? I mean, how would you summarize that point?
This is how we end up with the relativity thing, since intellect is now all about storing the representations we get from perception, which is pure, our representations that we construct, which is what moderns call thinking, is a subjective selection, and combination process. And
Yeah.
thus, this is why everybody has their own point of view. This is how everything comes down to relativity.
Yeah, there's a conception here that an object is given to us as a whole, and any act we do that divides that object is corrupting it.
Right.
And so that's the totality here. You're given through perception the pure, genuine, real object, and then any act of analyzing it is conceived of as somehow a corruption of the
That's
true
right.
object.
It's subjective, right? Your ideas and thoughts are subjective. So when you think about what you've seen, now you've changed it.
Exactly. You've altered it. I mean, that's why, you know, you can say that thinking is lying, because thinking is lying because you're distorting, you're changing the object merely by thinking. And that's not obviously what we do, but that's the necessary consequence of thinking about thinking as representation.
I think Tyler was really also pushing the fact that the moderns think that that thinking is about tearing things apart. Isn't that
Analysis, yeah. Mm-hmm.
so? I really like that distinction you added, Tyler. Thank you.
And I'd like to just also repeat this in the second sentence, right? Or the first and second sentence. The mental representation of an object can only correspond to the object. So there's only truth and there's only truth, and therefore there's only knowledge. When it produces in representation as a whole, completely and unfalsified without any alteration. All these conditions are held for good reason to be unrealizable, unattainable. And I think this is the skeptical problem right there, that knowledge is thought of through representation in such a way that knowledge becomes impossible, because there never is a satisfying representation. There is never a complete, total, whole, and unfalsified, unabstracted, or whatever, representation of the object. So already in these first sentences, we already see that to think of thought as representation of something other than itself means there's no such thing as truth, and there's no such thing as knowledge.
The way I see it, like at a very basic level, if we impart knowledge into the objects, so we're relying on the representation. So when I just rely on sight, what I'm saying is very obvious. I can never see that object fully, right? I can't see the other side of it.
Yeah.
I can't magnify my vision to see the individual, I don't know, cellular structures. Let's say it's a living thing, or the atoms.
Right.
At any one point when I view it, I'm only viewing like one very small aspect of it visually, and then there's the other aspects, right? So yeah.
I would add that an important part of that is that since it is your perspective that cuts you off from the other parts of that object, it is a subjective perspective.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, that's an interesting corollary. I mean, and that's okay. Yeah, cool. So you know, Schmidt's not saying that we never know. In fact, he says we know all the time. And he's saying, but the question is, does the representational model help us understand how it's possible for us to know? And every iteration, every reformulation of the representational model creates the exact same skeptical problems. There's always the gap between the representation and the thing represented. And that leaves us with skepticism on the one hand, right? We can never really know it. And then dogmatism on the other. So we'll just pragmatically say, you know, for our practical purposes, we'll just say that the object is blah, blah, blah. And we'll work with that in our science, and we'll work with that in our politics, and we'll work with that in the rest of, right? And so skepticism and dogmatism, or as he says, stoicism and skepticism are just two sides of the same coin here that, that arise through the representational aporia.
And I would add another thing in the post-truth world, the only thing left is argument ad authority. So it's the experts, it's the
Right.
scientists, it's people whose perspective can be trusted.
Actually,
So-
yeah, I want to chime in. I think this is especially true for like art or an architect, like architecture, something not science, because which is more subjective. So that is really don't have a very objective way to judge it. That's why, you know, you need critique. Somebody can get famous in a day.
Right.
Something worth nothing before, then the second day worth a lot of money. It's like, because who can set up the standard?
Yes. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, you know, the standard is one of those things that
That's
is
where the power.
incomprehensible. It's incomprehensible in a representational model. How can there even be a standard? How can critique improve anything if it's just your representations, and then somebody else comes along and gives you their representations, and then somebody else comes along and gives you their representations, right? Where's the standard coming from? On the representational model, it's incomprehensible how there can be a higher point of view that unifies.
Maybe there's some view are closer to the truth than the other views.
Yes.
I don't know.
There is, but you can't make sense of that on a representational model. And that's what makes this book interesting, is it helps us recognize the limits of that model, and helps us recognize that we always think in that model, because that's how we've been trained to think about thinking. And so it's very exciting to think that there are A, limits to that model of thinking, and B, that we can transcend them, and that we can actually thinking the way thinking is, and not just represent it. Okay,
I would
don't
like
wanna
to.
I don't want to get too dialectical here, but yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
I've been reading a book which Michael recommended to me about skepticism, and one of the things that came to mind here is theological disputes over who knows what God wants better than anyone else, or who knows the Word of God. And that problem arises with expertise here, because if you rely on something that is simply a individual's perspective, then everyone's perspective is no better than anyone else's.
Right.
And so if your interpretation of, say, God is based on this way of thinking, then there's no criteria by which one person's can be judged to be more or less valid than the other. And so the interesting thing in this book is that it goes over this whole theological disputes that are a result of this way of thinking.
Exactly. Now, beautiful. I would like to just look at what he says about the Platonic Aristotelian alternative to this perceptual representational model, and then talk about that a little bit. And I'd like to bring out I'd like to bring out an additional point once we've read through it. So Tyler, would you mind reading the next paragraph, please? Actually, since the third one's very short, just go ahead and read both.
All right, I'm on in contrast, correct?
Yes.
In contrast, knowledge in the Platonic Aristotelian sense of the word is discrimination of entities that are always definite in themselves. The conditions of the constitution of different forms of unity and of different relations among these entities are, with respect to objects or processes in nature or art, conditions of possibility. They clarify the possible forms of arrangement that enable parts to be combined in such a way that they form a comprehensive whole. They are thus the presupposition for what Plato and Aristotle call work. Someone who has a theoretical understanding of the figure formed when all the points of a plane figure are equidistant from the center can apply this knowledge in relation to something else, for example, to a medium that can be brought into this arrangement. This application then gives this material, for example, pliable wood, a uniform possibility, for example, of being bent into a circle. This becomes the work or the function of this object, which is then both recognized and linguistically described in terms of this function. One speaks in this case not of a piece of wood, but rather of a wheel. Further, one's cognitive focus is directed at that which makes this wooden object a wheel. Someone who perceives such an object and wants to know what it is does not need to recognize the entire object. Rather, he only needs to recognize the function it fulfills. One does not need to observe all the roof tiles of a house in order to recognize that they form a roof. The same thing holds when one wants to recognize the object in its entirety. In this latter case, one must be able, over and above the work of the object, to recognize its material in terms of its work. For example, that the wood of a wheel is comprised of a specific functional unity of cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, etc. One can only correctly grasp and define the composite, a wheel made out of wood, in this way without landing into confusion.
Right on, thank you. So here we have the concept of work reintroduced. And I'd just like us to discuss what we get out of this concept of work here and how it differs from the model presented in the philosophy of representation. So anybody wants to comment on that, please take the floor.
Yeah, I think so. For the Greeks, at least in my understanding, it seems like work is more centered on getting at what the thing is and the unity of the concept, whereas in representation, a lot of it rests on justification and trying to create a compelling narrative or argument to support whatever position you have been taken.
Yeah.
So work serves kind of a different function for the Greeks versus in modernity. In modernity, it's more about telling a really good argument versus, or it's more of a rhetorical position versus in Greek thought, it's more about trying to exercise the function of discernment as best as possible.
Right. I think that's very true. The first thing to notice is that the work of something, the function, is not given in perception. So I think that's one of the most important things to get out of this work is that what belongs to a thing, not all the sense data that we receive belongs to the thing that we want to know, right? Like whiteness, we might see, all we see is white human beings, but whiteness doesn't belong to what it is to be a human being, even though wherever we look, in some countries, all you see are white human beings. So there's two things to get. Not all sense data belong to the thing. So some of them don't belong to the thing, even though they appear to be important to that thing, like the whiteness of the skin, my skin. And not all that belongs to the thing is given in perception. I think these two things are incredibly important. Function is not given, function, which is the unity of the thing, is not given to perception. And what is given to perception, some of it is not relevant to that unity. So try to base the unity on sense data, you will fail. Try to impose unity on something, you will fail. Because that will just be a subjective imposition. So where we're at is that what makes a thing is only partly related to the sense data, and more fundamentally, it's related to the discernment or the grasping through the appropriate distinctions of the function, what that thing does. Because what that thing does tells us how all of its parts belong together.
Yeah, perception necessarily adds and removes things from what a being is.
Yeah.
So
it's simultaneously too much and too little. I think that's what's really important to grasp. It's too much and too little. It gives you too much because it gives you a lot of data that have nothing to do with the unity of the thing, and it gives you too little because it never gives you the unity of the thing.
Right, and the funny thing is that is you could characterize that as a corruption even more so than you could characterize thinking as a corruption.
Our meeting yesterday, the Hegel one that some of us went to, when they were trying to interpret that, I think paragraph 6, and somebody gave an example, like the essence of water is the
Oh, yeah.
H2O molecule. That is like totally wrong. And it's totally not what the Greeks meant when they're talking about function, right? You can't just use the scientific investigation of something to function either. Just like you can't use raw perception. You have to understand what it is. So if you want to know what water is, you have to think about what you use water for. And that's how I interpret it. I don't know if people want to criticize me on that, but
right, we'll never understand why water has the lubricity and fluidity by knowing it's 8 hydrogen and 2 oxygen molecules. Yeah, so I mean, it's so the essence is supposed to tell us not just how to pick it out, but what explains the properties that it has. And H2O doesn't do that.
Yeah, I want to chime in. So it's quite interesting. I was listening to this Google, they trying to develop AI, and they were talking about how they put lots of pictures of flower, like different type of flowers. And to train AI to able to recognize it's a flower, you can have big flower, small flower. So what's unity among those flower, make it flower? Human can easily recognize, but for a computer, they have to train them with lots of pictures to be able to identify, they can put out a flower and know it's a flower. It's very fascinating how this philosophy actually related closely to the AI training.
No, that is fascinating. And what's going to be a problem perhaps is that this AI would think that or would respond to, or I don't even know how to talk AI, but would pick out a movie prop of a flower because it corresponds to its image of what a flower is, even if that movie prop doesn't have any of the functional properties of a flower, namely, the organic processes that make a flower is how we begin to understand the functionality. Why does it have the petals? Why does it have the stem? Why are they placed the way they're placed? We only understand all these parts by the nature of the function that they all fulfill in maintaining this unity. And that is not something that you can ever get by even 10 million images of a flower.
That's a good point.
It's kind of
so function is totally different than anything that can be grasped by perception.
And I wanted to add, Gang, because I actually did some of this. I developed a neural network that actually recognized flowers. It was only 50% successful, but it really is a statistical thing. And we kind of just show the AI all these photos of flowers. So let's say I only showed the AI photos of flowers with 5 petals. So, and then I labeled that's a flower. And if I show the AI a photo of an elephant and say that's not a flower, that's how it trains it. But then if I show it a flower with 6 petals, it won't know it. And I have to sort of train it. And I think that's not exactly like knowledge that we're gaining. So I think
my point is, if we understand how human thinking, then we can make AI better because we don't really understand how we think. That's why we cannot recreate this AI because they have no idea. Like why we know it's a flower, it's a cup. They have different shape of cup. We all call it cup. Can be made of any material, any shapes. But we all know, look at it, we all know it's a cup. So it seems very simple for human, but it's very hard to recreate it because we don't understand the process.
Totally.
Yeah, with the when you're feeding something pictures of flowers, what it's going to churn out eventually is just it has what?
A form. It's only a form. It's not the form. FORM. Through picture, you only see the form of the things, right?
Well, the form and the function are going to be related for Aristotle, but what the AI does is it basically picks out things in terms of their similarity to the other pictures, like what's common to the pictures, and you would never arrive at a criteria for a flower. What you get is rather It has a bunch of things that it knows are called or named a flower by the person inputting the images as being images of flowers, but it never knows what about those pictures specifically makes them a picture of a flower and not something
Right.
else.
Exactly. Good.
Can I
Please.
and this is my problem, that I need to hear things repeatedly. So what Bo mentioned, Peter's ship on the horizon on the island example, and I think this had to do with the natives. So the natives seeing the ship and they don't know the work, right, or whatever. So that means that they are lacking knowledge. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're lacking a distinction, right?
A
And
distinction?
They
Okay.
don't even know what the, yeah. Well, Michael, you're correct.
No,
Hello?
yeah, because they don't have knowledge, because they don't know, because they don't have any criterion for establishing the unity of what they perceive, right? We grasp the unity of why is there that sail? Why is there that mast? Why does it have a rudder, right? We understand how they all fit together because we grasp the work of the boat. Whereas the native who's never seen such a thing, right, just sees just a whole bunch of different perceptual elements. It doesn't know how they fit together.
Yeah, you know, something that occurred to me thinking about that example is, you know, we make this error too. This isn't something that native people
Of
make.
course, yeah.
Naively, you could see a boat and see that it's made out of wood and think, oh, it floats on the water because it's made out of wood. But that's not precisely correct, right? It has to do with the fact that it's empty, right? You can make a boat out of metal that has a hollow space inside that has air in it that will still float.
Right.
So, you know, there's some subtlety in understanding exactly what a boat is or a ship is, right? It's not just the material it's made out of or particular details about what it looks like.
Good. That's exactly right. And then once we understand what it's supposed to do, what its work is, then we recognize that we're not limited to wood to make a boat, but there are other materials that will serve as a hull and all the rest of it, right? So now we have this variability, and we can expand our concept of boat by virtue of comprehending the work, but we would not be able to expand the concept of boat if we tied it to one perceptual quality like wood, which isn't really even a perceptual quality, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice discussion, guys. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, okay, the ship, yeah. Okay, let me see. Let's plunge on. Let's see. 12.4 and 12.5 are pretty complicated. I'm not quite sure if anybody has a stomach for them. If you have a lot of question marks, or if you're really excited about a point he was making there, let me know now, and we'll go for it. Because I'm happy to work through these. I'm just not quite sure how productive it's going to be for you. So you let me know.
Well, I take it in 12.4, then if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there, there is no sound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The koan has been solved. It's not good anymore for meditative practice.
Right.
What about
That if I may ask, that really corresponds to your little essay you wrote to us about art to a certain degree, doesn't it?
Please
The
explicate
idea
that.
the sound and the art would be analogous. Those two examples would be analogous to each other.
I'm not sure. What do you see in the sound example that reminds you of the art example?
Well, without the rationality, without the rational perception, neither art nor sound is present.
I see. Okay. I don't know, does anybody else want to take that? Because one of the things I was trying to do with that art piece was to show how the discriminations, we make distinctions that fail, and then we make distinctions that fail at capturing, why, for instance, music, sculpture, and poetry are all art. And we try to make a mistake, make a distinction, and it fails. And then what we do is we don't go and stare at the painting or listen even harder to the symphony, right? But we go for another higher order distinction, right? Which is purely investigating the content of the criteria itself. It's not running out and trying to perceive more, right? And so the art example gives us a good insight into what is it when we're trying to find out the being of art. We're not staring more closely at paintings, right? Perception becomes irrelevant. It really has to do with going higher up the ladder of conceptual distinctions in order to find the appropriate contents that will allow us to understand why all of these things are art and how they're distinct from other things that are not art. And I gave the Greek example that I thought does a good job, at least preliminarily, at showing that.
Yeah, I think.
So I think it's a very, very hard for people to grasp, this reflection on criteria, right? What does that even mean? And the point of that art example was to try to make that a little bit clearer.
Yeah, I think the question that's being highlighted in the example is when you are looking at something and you're thinking of it as art, you had to ask yourself, well, why am I thinking of this as art, which is not going to be answered by simply looking at it more.
Right.
So going and looking at another picture that you think of as art doesn't tell you why you've selected those two images as images of art.
Exactly right.
That's the problem the AI has, right? That's the exact problem the AI has.
Yes.
Oh, great. Can you say that more?
I mean, even if it has neurons that are conditioned to recognize things based on patterns, those patterns are just accidental to the actual being of what is in the picture.
Right.
What's in the picture, a flower, you could have like Rafflesia is a flower. Orchids are flowers. They look very different from, a classical flower.
Right.
Even a rose is very different from a daisy or a tulip. So there isn't any particular shape that defines a flower.
That's right. Should we look at this? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say on 12.4, the thing that really struck me was that truth is a correspondence of representation and object. Those things are by nature split apart by definition. There's that gap between the representation and the object, whereas the identity, the cognitive act, and the matter is all sort of co-located in mentality or whatever, however you want to.
Right.
And
There's
so
no gap.
To overcome there.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, and yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if everyone's okay going into the text, I did want to go over 12.4 and
excellent.
That contrast, awesome. That contrast part. So yeah, that last paragraph on that page. So I think I understood everything, and if I can read the second sentence, for example, sound, as we hear it, is none of the objects to which our perception is related. It is not the periodic vibration of air.
Hold on one second, Mike. Let me see. Does everybody see where we are at? We're at page 535, last paragraph on the page. Second or 4 lines down.
I'm showing it, Michael. I'm tracking. Mike and I.
Cool. Thank you. So I have the group chat blocking the text. There we go.
So yeah. So for example, sound it's none of the objects to which our perception is related. It is not the periodic vibration of air, nor the movement of the eardrum, nor that of the nerve impulses, etc. So I think I got that. But then this next sentence, one does not perceive any of this in hearing. This sentence, sound is rather a specific state of being disposed, one transports oneself into, almost as if one's own accord through following the specific movements of these materials.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I'm completely lost with that one.
Who wants to take a stab at it? Yeah, I mean, I don't have a really pithy answer to that. I'm actually going to look that line up in German and see if it helps. But if anybody else has a thought about that, I'd love to hear it.
I think I'm not sure if I understand correctly, but I think sound is vibration, right? When you strike the drum, there's a sound. And I think when we can feel the power of the music, whatever, because somehow there was kind of, what do you call it? The two things operate, like vibrate together, create this kind of, what do you call it? I don't even know the word, sorry. But anyway, so when you reach that state, then you have this strong feeling. I think that's why you have.
The complication is that an account of vibrations being sound would then fail to explain, they would fail to be a causal relationship, which is what they want to do with vibration. Vibration changes the way the air is, and then that causes us to hear sound, which is an affectation. The sensation and the perception of sound can't be the same if there's going to be that causal relation. Because air can vibrate without a person hearing something. So the air vibrating cannot be the same thing as the sound that you may or may not hear when air is vibrating.
Yeah, so it's only in, okay, so it's only, and this is not something conscious, but this is something that hearing does. It's a certain set of distinctions that it's making. Hearing is making distinctions between all of these material states, and we hear, insofar as we put ourselves into, insofar as we follow the distinctions that our hearing makes, and thereby grasp a set of sounds, for instance, as a melody, as a theme, as a fugue, as a repetition, and as we grasp the distinctions, the qualities of the sound become more discriminate.
Yes, I think a good
enjoyment of it is richer because we notice more and more of what's going on in that sound.
Yeah, I think a good thing to think about here is you can be in the room with someone speaking. All of the sound vibrations are happening, and you can hear absolutely none of what that person is saying because you're not making distinctions.
Right.
I've done this before.
Yeah, so you
right, that's right.
Doing it now.
That is hearing the sound. It isn't like a passive process, right? You become the being hearing the sound.
Yes. That's a profound way to put it. Yes.
I understood it as when these things occur, vibrations, etc., you have the capacity to receive that and the capacity to receive that as a rational being. And that then makes it sound. That when a rational being perceives those circumstances and that set of physical circumstances, that makes it sound then. That we have the disposition, or we have the capacity to do that. I mean, that is what we do. That's knowledge that we have and that we are actually.
It's some kind of decoding, like you receive this information, you have to decode it to understand the sound. You receive the vibration, but you have to be able to decode, make it into a sound.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, but decoding is not something that we do. Yeah, I think that would be part of what he calls, the discriminations that hearing itself is. Hearing is the ability to discriminate certain aspects of vibrations of air, movement of eardrums, affecting nerve impulses, right? That all of these physiological phenomena are discriminated in a particular way not visually, not hearing is not noticing this happens and then this happens, right? But discriminating according to its ability, namely hearing sound. And then as these vibrations and all the rest of it change, we hear richer sounds, different sounds, and all the rest of it. But what's important is that none of the things that we could actually like visually see, like vibrations and movements of the eardrum or something like that, are sound.
Sound is a much harder example than sight.
Yeah, it's
Sight-
true.
Sight is much better. So in sight, what do your eyes see? They see shifts in color, light, and shadow. But you see an automobile. That unity is what your brain does with sights, with colors and shadows. So I mean, so different air pressures are put together in your brain as Beethoven's fifth, just like your eyes see an automobile, a tree. So that synthesis is what makes, that's the step that is in perception.
I think what's complicated about this is this whole idea that there is not a sound first there, and then our eardrums pick up on it, right? But the sound is identical with the hearing of the sound. And that's what makes this very, very difficult. It's not like I said, there's not like this sequence. There's a sound there, and then eventually it hits us. And so now now we hear the sound. But the being of the sound and the hearing are one. They're simultaneous. And
yeah, the important thing is that
that's why it would be an abstraction to say, well, there's a sound out there, and eventually it hits us. There's a vibration. There's vibrations. That's not sound. There's the eardrums moving around. That's not sound. There's all this physical phenomenon going on. That's not sound. So we have to make the right discriminations to know what belongs to sound and what doesn't belong to sound.
And Kelly's acting up in the chat. I'd like to give him some airtime right now.
Oh, shit, I've been found out.
Oh.
No,
Are you busted?
and I threw basically a Molotov cocktail into the chat. No, because I was thinking about how, okay, I should have specified more. I'm thinking more in terms of grammar and not language, as far as one thing where modernity could actually kind of be helpful in a particular case, because in terms of grammar and trying to correspond whether or not a text is cohesive or correct is really relative and dependent on the internal cohesion, a certain sense of like cohesions and stuff like that versus corresponding to the truth of things.
So grammar is unity. Grammar provides unity.
Grammar does provide unity, so maybe there is a Greek way of looking at grammar. However, no, and the reason I bring this up is because Peter and I were arguing privately about what the correct spelling of the possessive form of Theseus is. Is it S' or just S'? And two different camps have particular opinions about this. So maybe grammar just constitutes opinion, and then we can't necessarily apply Greek methodology to it, but maybe not. So discuss.
Sorry, Kelly, but it's still
That's fine.
I think grammar is a way of a unity because it is shared amongst us, right? What would all the letters be together? What would the words be together without grammar?
But also at the same time, grammar is very, very much made up. And the correctness of grammar constantly differs depending on what particular like style guide you're using, and also what particular like groups of people are going to agree whether certain words are words on the one hand, and also whether they have certain cohesion. I mean, you can think of like, particular dialects making their way into standard American English and words being constantly added to the Oxford Dictionary, that type of thing. So there is a little bit of wiggle room. I don't know if there necessarily would be a truth of grammar. I could be wrong about this. Yeah, I think in some particular cases,
Actually,
I don't
this
know. I'm thinking.
I don't know what to think about grammar, to be honest.
actually kind of ties to the text. When we get to section 12:11, we start talking about natural language and the Hellenistic school. So we can segue into there when we get there.
You know, but I don't think it's an accident the Greeks didn't teach grammar as one of their foundations of education. It didn't belong to quadrivium, which was math and astronomy and music and geometry, right? So these were sciences of order and of universal order, and grammar doesn't fit that. That has something like you
Right.
said, something very kind of historical and pragmatic, and it is not the order of language. It's one way to parse language in order to see some of the structures that are there. It's the Romans who added grammar to the educational curriculum, right? And in a sense, the Romans are responsible for the slip from the universal to the particular in educational curriculum, right?
Yeah, well, so
It makes
Kelly,
good sense not to think of grammar as something universal and necessary.
I think we should be careful about the sentence, but Kelly was joking that this is something that modernity could add, but I would add this is what modernity loves. Oh, shared narrative. Reality is agreement.
Which is why you have grammar Nazis in modernity, and you don't have that in the ancient world. I mean, they don't give a shit. Maybe it's a better way of characterizing this is it's an indication of like what modernity cares about versus what Greek values are. And so, yeah, maybe because it is a modern construction, you have to approach it on modern terms in order to get anything out of it.
That's a very interesting point.
All right.
I want to expand on it, but I just for our time's sake.
It's a total tangent, and I apologize. But
that was fun.
I sort of just want to complain about dictionaries, but I'll leave it alone.
All right. So I'm not sure. I have to say a number of his. I meant actually to go back and go over all his examples of sound because he does bring it up a lot, right? The unity of sound is very different from the multiplicity of the physical processes that are not sound, but are the necessary conditions of sound, right? And he brings that up a lot here to show that there's a discriminatory process in every one of our senses. Every sense makes distinctions. And it is only the sense that it is through the kinds of distinctions that it makes. So it's never, so part of his point is it's never immediate. It's never simply receptive. None of our senses, sensing something is never simply receptive, just getting walloped by something from outside of ourselves, right? A visual input or an oral input or something like that. That's a myth of the given, or that's a myth of human pure receptivity. And so all of his sense examples are all showing the ways in which intelligence is discriminating in order to isolate what belongs to the sound and what doesn't belong to the sound, such that one can hear the sound.
Michael, I found one of his examples, page 47. The eye does not see an airplane. The ear does not hear an airplane. Rather, the eye's objects are the colors and forms. Well, that he does. Look, I searched for sound. It's all over the book.
Okay. Oh, sweet.
Yeah. Computers have their purposes, my friend.
Fucking hell. I didn't realize we could do that. That's great.
That's Control F. Wow, you're in the Stone Ages.
Whoa. That would be, that's I'm always just used to these physical objects where I got to flip through and, okay, but never mind. Thank you. Yeah. Right. That is another point. You can't see an airplane. You can only see colors. Right? And to discriminate colors properly according to the way in which those colors are organized into one thing, you have to grasp the function, and then you understand which are the relevant colors. You understand why the blue sky doesn't belong to the airplane, because the blue sky is, even though it's a color next to other colors, the blue sky is not part of the work of the airplane, and so we can discriminate the sky from the airplane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not something we can do just on the basis of color alone.
All right.
Yeah. Awesome. So the visual thing is easier to understand than the oral thing. But so I hope that helped a little bit, Mike. I don't know if it helped very much.
All right. So section 12.4, have we finished that?
Anybody else want to bring anything up in 12.4?
No, I think that covered what I was thinking about, and it helped me to interpret it.
Okay, cool.
I
All
would
right.
add one short thing, which
Please.
would be if the sensation was purely receptive, we'd have no basis for just distinguishing between different forms of sensation, because we don't know whether what kind of thing we're receiving from the outside. We would only know the way that it affects us, and therefore we don't know whether these distinctions are caused by one or many things.
Well, you know what, Michael, I think what I could ask from you is, why don't you recapitulate this consciousness, unconsciousness thing, which Arbogast Smith really, he had a good time ripping that to pieces, and how that ties in with the philosophy of representation and modernity. There.
Okay. You always ask me to pull the rabbit out of the hat here, Bo. I guess the first place to start is that the Greeks didn't, Plato and Aristotle, their schools didn't have a concept for consciousness. That comes much later in history. So they worked just fine without thinking about consciousness. And I guess I'm just going to relate this to what I was talking about earlier to Tyler and Peter and you. The Greek philosophical reflection is distinguished in the first instance from modern philosophical conception insofar as the Greeks turn to thought to find the unity of things, whereas the moderns turn to the subject. Now, the subject is always opposed to an object. That subject is consciousness, and consciousness is always other than that which it's conscious of. And so to turn to ourselves as like Descartes did and Locke did, right? Descartes turns to the subject to find the ground of certainty, the indubitability, and Locke turns to our inner introspection in order to find, the sources of our judgments. So they're turning to the subject, and the subject is always different from the object. And so once that happens, the object is always represented to consciousness, because consciousness is not that object out there, or any of those objects out there, right? So once reflection, so what happens is, and this is important for Hegel, once reflection happens, well, reflection is either to the subject, now we're opposed to a world of objects that are external and different from us, as over against reflection being turning towards thought being thought of the unity and therefore of the being of things. And in the reflection to thought rather than to the subject, we're not opposed to an external world that we somehow have to bridge a gap to get to, but we are at the basis of the unity of or the sameness of being and knowledge. So these respective turns to thought as opposed to turn to subject are decisive. Both of them are forms of reflection, but what the product of that reflection is. In the one case, it's consciousness as opposed to a world. In the other, it is the relations of contents to one another, and they are all mutually, internally related to one another. There is no outside, there's no externality there anymore. So, right. So we see that, we just see that this whole problem of thinking the unity of being and knowledge can only be achieved by a certain kind of reflection. And if we opt for this other kind of reflection, we will never attain it. And in a matter of fact, we will never attain knowledge whatsoever, because the world always eludes all of our representations once we think that knowledge is based on consciousness.
Yeah, I'm going to dumb it down. I think I just asked you to solve the mind-body split that modernity is obsessed with. Sorry about that. And that was huge. Thank you, Michael. As I recall, so if it's all representations, it's the outside world. So the perception gives you it. So it's all about the clarity of that representation, right? So that's why consciousness is such an, that's why their unconsciousness becomes at issue, because what did perception give you, which your consciousness didn't fully apprehend or deal with, blah, blah, blah. I'm remembering the argument, Smith's argument here, or is it useful to talk about it? That's the next question.
No, go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, when you have this conception of things being given to people, the problem is, how do we go about dealing with the fact that we're given different things? And so if getting at the things we're given is supposed to be our criteria or our way of towards getting at the truth of things, everyone has a different truth because they're given different things.
Right.
And they are, it is impossible for them to determine what the truth is.
Right. And just like we saw that part of what makes an object the object that it is never given perception and relates to this function. I mean, we can see that we only understand what function is as through a discriminating what the thought of function from the thought of what's not function and all the rest of it. And now we're into the reflective appropriation of the contents of our thought in order to make the appropriate distinctions. And so here that's the retreat to thought, and that's not the retreat to subjectivity. It's not my distinction. The distinction between function and non-function is not my personal distinction based on my representations, based on what direction my body is facing, right? So when I think of thought as my thought, I'm thinking thought as representation. When I think of thought as the locus of the being of things, I'm not thinking my thought anymore. I'm thinking objective thought. And the Greeks were nothing other than gave us a million exercises for attaining objective thought and escaping the dead ends of thinking about thought as my thought and thereby turning it to a representation of something external.
I think the other thing that plays into the difference between the Greeks and us in terms of what we're talking about is that because we live in an age of individualism, the self is really a big deal. Yeah. And everything, you know, we tend to think of everything in relationship to ourselves. And the Greeks did not do that at all. They really minimized their sense of self, if they even had one, because they looked at the world so differently from the way we look at it. It was more their place in society that was important, doing their duty that was important, serving their family and bringing honor to their family that was important. It was just not about them.
Right. That's right. And so that might be a set of very appealing practices, but what is, I don't know, just provocative is that that attitude, at least in the philosophical schools, might have been founded on something more primordial, a kind of ontological consideration about what the being of things is and how one attains understanding of that being.
Yeah, you know, in economics, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, his unit of like economic decision making was like the firm or the household. Yeah. It wasn't really the individual. So the households made their decisions on where to spend their money. The individualism is sort of a modern turn. I think the explanation for that, at least historically, is through changes in distribution of wealth, because in the Victorian era and earlier, for most of history, relatively few people have controlled almost all of the wealth. And there were very few economic opportunities for most people. So you had to live together as a family just to survive.
Right.
Well, people were agrarian. Majority of the people were on a farm, and that's on a farm. You are a group. You're not an individual on a farm.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, and like in modern times with this more egalitarian distribution of wealth, now we have the freedom to be individual in our economic decisions.
Yes, and see how we've used it.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna say I'm willing to jump over the language part. It's very complicated, goes into Stoics. I'm happy to go into it, but my vote is to skip it. But if anybody was excited about this or had really an interest, a question, I'm happy to look at it a little bit. I did look at it very carefully today in view of Gadamer, the mention about Gadamer that Bo pointed out to us last time. But I think that in order to make sense of the critique of Gadamer, we'll have to go into a lot of background material. You know, what the hell? I mean, if it's what people are interested in, that's what we should do. I mean, I'm not going to dictate terms here. I'm just
I think we should look at this a little bit. I mean, Schmidt thinks it's important enough to call it out.
Indeed, indeed. Okay.
Yeah, come on. We're talking about hermeneutics here.
So without reading the whole thing, what can we? So the larger point is whether thought and language are basically synonymous, or whether there's a fundamental distinction. And he's making the point that Aristotle thinks of language as tracking the discriminatory capacities of our various faculties. And so language is not doing the work of thought, but language is expressing the thought that's already been done. And he's accusing the Stoics, you know, these poor Stoics, get the brunt of a lot of critique as thinking about, you know, what happens with our sensations, right? Our sensations give us some kind of data, and our perception represents that in a representation. And now what needs to happen is that representation itself is not a statement. It's just a picture. And so now we need an additional processing of our representation. And they think of that as linguistification, basically by turning, linguistifying the representation in a higher order representation, right? We bring out the propositional structure and then say, for instance, my picture of a red apple is not the same as the statement, the apple is red. And so for going from the red apple as representation to the apple is red is what they call that the act of thought, which is nothing other than the act of expressing in language the propositional content of the representation. So in this sense, the processing of thought is not separate from just giving language to that representation. And so that means that giving language and thought are the same. And that means that language contributes to the content of the object. And that will obviously get us into relativisms, right? Because there's different languages. And so if different languages are contributing to the nature of the object, then, you know, each language will have its own set of objects. Every language will live in its own linguistically solipsistic world and all the rest of it. That's the point I see. Maybe you guys see some other stuff.
Well, I don't know. I take contention with the point that you can be in a linguistically solipsistic mode because we have translation, right? And often what the work of translation attempts to do is to get at the thing which might be only expressed in like one word or like a couple of words in another language, but contains some element of thought. Thus, it is not so unintelligible that it can't be translated. So
Excellent.
there is a thing to be referred to or pointed at, but when you try to like tackle this problem with linguists, they just throw up their hands and go, it's, you know, it's the problem of hermeneutics or translation or something like that. And like, no, you're doing something.
I totally agree with we do that, right?
Yeah.
The question is whether we can make sense of that on the basis of thought as mere linguistification, and what it's linguistifying is representations. Now, obviously, translation, what is the object of thought when we translate, right? And that is the meaning of what's said in another language. That is not a perceptual representation. So translation itself, in order to make sense of translation itself, we have to isolate. So what are my criteria for distinguishing what this sentence is expressing? Staring at the sentence, redrawing the characters, being mired in representation will never help us make the right discriminations to determine what the meaning of that sentence is. You know, what are the nuances and all the rest of it. So all I want to say is you're absolutely right, but you're also making Schmidt's point for him insofar as you are appealing to higher order criterial kinds of decisions in order for a translation to take place that themselves are not staring at representations. Do you accept that, or you think I'm screwing up your point?
No, I think you're adding to it in a constructive way, so that,
appreciate that.
works. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, like, translation as well. I guess the art of translation isn't just getting the meaning. If you can, it's getting like the form of how it's said, I guess the poem or whatever, unless it's like just an academic text or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and you have to be able to distinguish all of that, right? Yeah. And your perceptions aren't going to help you do it. Like just looking at ink blots on the papyrus is not going to help you determine those nuances and the form and the flow and the intonation and all the rest of it, right? That's based on a whole slew of criteria that you can improve and say, well, if this word, normally this word appears after it as a post-positive, but here it's not being used as a post-positive. So now what that means that there's a different kind of emphasis going on in this sentence, and that has, right, and right, right, and understanding something as a post-positive is already based on a set of discriminations that have nothing to do with what your perceptions give you.
Okay.
Everybody happy with that point?
Yeah, I think that words, the way we use them in language, they're an expression of functional unity, and translation does the work of figuring out what functional unities do we use these to do we use these words to bring to mind that concept to another person in this language?
Right. I'll be right back. I'll be right back. Keep up the conversation.
That was all I had. So if anybody else.
Well, I'm going to ask Kelly. Kelly, I was really surprised to see him take on Gadamer, man. I was like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, Gadamer is kind of like, I don't know, like the 21st century golden boy. Like people don't normally attack him like that. But you know, it's fair game. But
so is the critique that Gadamer, and who knows if Gadamer really believes this, but that somehow knowledge is immanent in language and text?
So the thing you have to understand about hermeneutic approaches to thinking is that they kind of, a lot of it rests on the belief that something is lost within the act of translation or the act of interpretation, that somehow like the text contains some kind of like purity itself, and in the act of doing that interpretation, and perhaps more accurately the act of representing it, something gets fucked up majorly. And it's sort of the task of hermeneutics to sort of figure out where that went wrong and why. And this is a purely, like, you can think of it too as it's a purely modern problem, because if you're not concerned with ideas about like truth or the concept, this is just going to be an eventual thing for you, is sort of that act of discerning whether or not your representation is more correct with, or more cohesive within your own line of thinking.
Oh yeah, and your perspective on the text, right?
Correct. That's what's important. And so it's very, very modern. And so it kind of makes sense why Schmitt would
It's a modern funhouse. This is what philosophy is today, is endless literary criticism of the text, right?
Yeah.
And reinterpretation. Oh yeah. This is what, how many PhDs are minted off of this stuff, huh, Kelly?
Oh my God. Well, and also too, like, yeah, this is where you get like, you know, literature departments where it's just kind of like, yeah, this rotating funhouse of like, well, what did Melville really mean by the white whale? And, you know, people's careers are just like hinge on this like one tiny specific detail within like whatever the hell some author meant. And most of the time, I can say this as a writer, like authors are fucking with you. So it like, it almost doesn't matter, you know, what the true or more accurate representation is, as far as literary is concerned. But once we start doing philosophy this way, I think this is where Schmitt and maybe other Neoplatonists are starting to, you know, take up the torch a little bit, as far as like, you can't start thinking of the world this way, or it's going to lead to this endless chain of problems that actually might be very easily solvable if you added a couple of things to your perspective. But if not, it's going to be this endless feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the I think I understand to some extent why someone like Gadamer thinks the way he does, or at least the way Schmitt characterized him. I'm not, you know. So one of the things that might be lost is context. And so I can understand how it would seem like a text taken out of the richer context that a person more familiar with the entire language that text is written in may lose something.
The cultural milieu, yes.
But I think that's in some sense correct. So, but it isn't that the meaning is in the words or the representations. What it is that it's in that greater context, and you can lose something when a text is abstracted from the language it was written in. But it's rather that the text is being read by someone who lacks the greater context presupposed by the writer.
Mm.
And this, I think that song lyrics would be a really quick, easier to get at example of this, where the songwriter is going to presuppose some familiarity with certain ways of speaking of their time that later people listening to that song may be completely oblivious to. And this is a logistical problem of using language. It isn't a conceptual problem itself.
Yeah, how to evoke. That was a great example, by the way, song lyrics. Someone should write Gadamer, tell him that Tyler helped him out today.
Is he still alive?
No.
No. Okay.
Hard to write to him. I was
He's
gonna
born in
ask-
1900, and I think he died in 2002 or something like that. So
Okay.
he gave you a long, long time to write your damn letters, and you.
Well, I was 8 years old in 2002, so I have an excuse. I was trying to like use the toaster by myself at that point. That was the extent of my problems. Not hermeneutics.
I have a question. Like, is Hegel one of these hermeneutical types? It seems like he is not putting truth in language at all? Like, isn't that what sense certainty has as one of its theses? But at the same time, it seems like after Hegel, that's when all of this stuff exploded, and like, you know, like Zizek's Lacanian interpretation is very heavily weighted on language.
Mm-hmm.
So I was sort of almost hoping Michael knows the answer to this question.
Well, I don't think Hegel was hermeneutical. No.
Okay.
The concept has nothing to do with hermeneutics, baby.
No, but yeah, no, I think that Hegel's Aristotelian in the Schmittian sense, insofar as the totality of logical distinctions are the basis of any language.
Okay.
Peter, you look very concerned. You want to?
Yeah, Peter. I can't see Peter's video. Is Peter going apoplectic?
He looked like he really disagreed with me on that one. So I just wanted to find the basis.
Myself.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so if you think about, so the short answer is that thought is prior to language, but thought is the basis of any language, and it's so to speak the matrix, or what do you want to say that it's the basis that all languages share, independent of their specific historical anthropological determinations that allow Eskimos to have 17 words for snow and us to only have 1 or 2 or whatever.
I hate that example so much.
I know, but it's the one that everybody always brings up. That comes to mind. Give me a better one.
Now you made Kelly apoplectic, Michael.
Okay,
No more Eskimo snowflakes.
Right,
Stupid
okay.
literary cliches. Like, that's just, I hate it so much.
Thank you. But the point is that, of course, everybody understands the point, that these are historical particularities based on the experiences of an historical people, right? But the fact that all languages are translatable into each other means that languages have logical features that are expressed in them in their structures that allow this translatability that has nothing to do with the historical development of any given language, right? No, these languages didn't all come into contact with one another so that they could develop rudimentary translations of one another, but it's, so to speak, an essential part of language that it's translatable. And Hegel says, yeah, well, there's a reason for that, because they all are particular mirrors of the logical totality.
The languages of like connoisseurship can actually be interpreted not as, they're interpreted as excluding, but actually they are including.
Yes.
They are inclusive because they are welcoming.
Exactly right.
The capacity to hold a greater level of differentiation.
Yeah. Yes, I mean they're all permeable to one another, and what accounts for this permeability? Not the history of any of these languages. They didn't all grow together and then thereby translate themselves into one another, but so to speak, the common soil out of which they all grew is the logos or nous, or the totality of logical distinctions that are expressible in all of them. Yeah. So anyway, that's the short answer to Hegel, Aristotle, and language.
Thanks.
All right.
So Schmitt would have no truck for our current focus on diversity.
What do you mean by our?
Sorry, thank you. For the in the culture. I mean, this is, you see it in the political rhetoric right now in Portland.
Well, you know, that's an interesting question, but
the value, it's because it's typically a diversity of experience as reflected in a diversity of mutually unintelligible language.
I mean, one can look at it in the terms of the dialectic of skepticism and dogmatism, right? If a particular point of view becomes the dominant point of view and thereby presents itself as if it were universal when it's actually only particular, then that elicits a skeptical moment where diverse other groups deny the universality of that dominant paradigm, and thereby start taking it apart. Now, one could look at this as the labor of the negative, right?
Yes, right.
So diversity could be part of establishing of allowing what's properly universal to become manifest.
Yeah.
And it's always a one-sided universality, an abstract universality that elicited the need for diversity in the first place.
Oh, that was nice. Because my explanation is, so that was good. Let's hold Michael's. That's really good. The other thing is, I see the diversity thing as part of the war of power about which version of the truth is going to be the one.
Yes.
And we can't trust these people, so let's go to this group, and let's go to this group, and let's go to this group. But I like what Michael's saying, because behind indeed a universal that works for all of us. I think that would be the Aristotelian goal. I think modernity, it's just a power struggle. Done.
Right.
Yeah, I take an even more cynical interpretation.
Garth, more cynicism than me?
By maintaining our
Hard
own
to do.
culture as the universal in which we entertain these different diverse elements, we reduce the diverse elements to a state where they can never have universality on their own. And so it's a way of actually oppressing minorities by celebrating their diversity.
Oh yeah, that was some sick stuff, Garth.
Garth, damn.
In our culture, just to demonstrate the superiority ultimately of what is still white culture.
Yeah.
Man, I need to get you a job at BlackRock, Garth.
Oh my God, that's too much.
Oh,
all right, so the next paragraph is really short, and so let me see. It's just because everybody's going to leave here pretty soon. Let's try to get to 12:6, and then I'm going to submit versions of all your questions and ones that have occurred to me over the last couple of weeks. I'm going to submit them all to you, and we will finish this book. I swear to God, we're going to finish this book next time and discuss the questions, so that we can perfect them, so that there actually are questions we really care about having answered. And then I'm going to send those off to Professor Schmidt, and then we'll see what happens after that. Is everybody cool with that, or is there anything else we need to do?
Well, this next paragraph is really important, abstract versus concrete. I mean, that's something I really learned through this book with you.
You did say that you're going to send out the questions before we will have a chance to review them written before we have to discuss them next week, right?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to try to actually get it done tomorrow. That's my project for tomorrow, is see if I can collate all the questions and get them out to you.
Yeah, once we've seen them, I may or may not want to add, but I'm kind of assuming certain things will be brought up by other people, so we'll see how.
Okay, yeah. But just in reading through them, if there's any new questions that pop in your head, just write them down. You know, let's leave it up to Schmidt whether he wants to answer or not. But I think the more fertile our questions are, the more interesting the conversation will be down the road.
We don't want him writing another 500-page book, though.
Or do we?
That'd be awesome.
Don't you want to be thanked in the preface?
Yeah, that would be the shit.
All right, so yeah, let's get to this mercifully short but very important paragraph 12:6, and see, right, thought is abstract versus thought is concrete, right? That's something that we almost never hear, that thought is concrete. We always think that feelings and perceptions and stuff like that are concrete, but thought is always abstract. That shows our being chained to this representational model of thinking. So let's see what he has to say here. Can somebody just read the first paragraph? Whoever wants to volunteer.
Okay, I will.
Awesome, thank you.
One of the consequences of this elevation of representation to the genuine instrument by means of which human cognition discloses the world is that the contents of thought must then be held to be abstract. In the opinion of the Stoic thinkers, external objects imprint themselves on representation through perception. Such an impression on representation is not yet thought. It is simply an immediate possession. Only when this impression is represented clearly and evidently through the clear evidence arising in the soul does it first become the content of thought, more precisely, of consciousness. Thought consents to evident and clear representations of its own accord. The reason for error is consenting to representation to representations whose evidence is not yet clear enough. Representations that have been made present through thought's consent, the syncatathesis ad sensio, are thoughts or concepts, the en noemata. These thoughts are not identical with the pure impression of the object as a whole. Rather, they are that particular internal content of thought to which is consented on account of its evidence. Thought can operate on these contents according to its own laws of association. It can compare, combine, separate. It can synthesize what is similar to a concept, can infer a smaller thing from a larger thing, for example, a dwarf from a normal man, or the original from the resemblance, what is presented from its image, etc. All these concepts are subjective compositions that apply to various different things. They are general and abstract. In contrast to this concept of thought, which is oriented toward the logical states of representation, the Platonic Aristotelian conception leads to a concept of thought as something concrete. What can be distinguished as identical in an object is its work, that is, the functional act with respect to which all its parts are arranged. A scissor is something that can and does cut. An ear, something that hears sound. That is, the effect of a specifically modulated movement of specific materials. If one pays attention to the way individual objects, such as the organ of hearing, fulfill this function, then one widens one's concept of this organ with each new cognitive act. One will see that the organ of hearing can be realized in either this or that material. It can be structured either thus or thus, etc. By differentiating between the work or function of an organ and the material from which it is realized each time, one gains an ever more varied understanding of the possibilities of such realization. The concept becomes all richer, not poorer, the more varied the objects to which it is applicable. Only when we penetrate the work of something does it take on a concrete, sensible form for us. A cluster of sensory appearances first becomes a weaver's shuttle, or an ovary, or a thymus gland, or a concerned face in the instant that we penetrate the work of these appearances.
Awesome.
Thanks, Charlie. Now I have a joke for this. Well,
Okay.
the Aristotelians would understand that Rush Limbaugh's cochlear implants are his ears.
His what implants?
Are his ears. They perform the function of an ear for that cyborg Rush Limbaugh.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, exactly. They don't have to be fleshly organs. All right. So why is thought necessarily abstract on a certain model of thinking?
Because it comes after the given whole and takes it apart or cuts it up.
Right.
Yeah, that was good, Tyler. And Because thought only tears things apart in the representational model.
Well, yeah, but it also rebuilds them. Right.
Yeah, there was.
Yes, and that's another thing. Thought operates on the content of thought. Thought can operate on these contents according to its own laws of association. It can compare, combine, separate. It can synthesize what is similar to a concept, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so all of these processes, I mean, they really are presented here as processes, are formal insofar as they do not add any, or they don't add anything to the content that's here conceptualized is completely given in the perception. And so now all thought is fiddling around with reality. And so all of its products are reduced examples of that original reality, or that original thing, the well-determined thing. Right. So on this model, all thought is necessarily abstract, insofar as it always is a detraction from what's really real.
The well-determined object, because knowledge is out there, not in our head.
Yeah, I think we have a pretty good handle on that, right? And so, but this is not. This theory is not based on an analysis of thought as such, but it is the result of thinking thought in a certain way. And I think that's the most important point is we assume thought to be a certain way without inquiring into whether it is indeed that way. And then we discover, once we begin investigating it, that it leads to all these paradoxes and all these problems. So I like to think of this book as, this book is just giving you like all of the dialectical dead ends that Plato explored in his dialogues, right? This does it in like one big thick book, all the dead ends of thinking about piety and justice and knowledge and the sophist in particular ways that are always one-sided, that are always subjective, that are always representational, that are always accidental, get you into all these aporia. This book is laid out before us. And so, I mean, which is kind of exciting, because now we've done all the negative work. And now when we do look at Plato, we can actually not spend all our time having our own biases refuted, but can actually look at the positive work that is simultaneously going on in the distinctions that Socrates is introducing into the dialogue. Sorry, that was
down at the bottom of the page. I thought, at least for me, it was very instructive on bottom page 541, where the perception, the representation, and the intellect can compare, combine, separate, synthesize what is similar. It can are smaller, larger, etc. You can do all this kind of stuff, but it really kind of just playing with objects in and of themselves. It's not contributing to any real understanding of them. Mm-hmm. And all you have is just one individual object alongside each other.
Right.
And perceive them is really about all you have.
Yes. Okay. Now, just in our waning moments. Oh, it's already after 5. But just let's talk about that last paragraph. Where does the concrete? What justifies using the word concrete to describe thought in the second paragraph?
And this is really important. This ties to Hegel, doesn't it?
Indeed.
Well, my understanding was that what makes this concrete if you look at the work of an object, and if you have, I was wondering, is this where the idea of the universal comes in? If you really perceive the universal and not just the opinion, not just the discrete objects, you begin to understand what a thing is and why is it there, what is it for, how does it function,
yeah.
And you begin to understand the entire begin to understand this entire being, this entire thing that you have in front of you, rather than just looking at it as an object. And once you attain that more complete, this full understanding of it, then that's what makes it a really concrete matter of knowledge that you have.
It's your knowledge of the form of it that makes it concrete.
Yeah, that was my understanding, yeah. That
Right,
if you-
so, but how can we understand that? I mean, how would you explicate that? Why is that concrete? I mean, if we think of abstract as taking a part of a well-determined object and taking a part of that well-determined object and separating it and inspecting it for itself, right? So we take the redness away from a toy and just inspect its redness, right? That would be an example of thought as abstract. So what's so instead of taking something out here, what is concrete? And that's kind of the inverse. How do we understand that here?
Well, for example, if you have a whole room full of toys in a daycare center, and you see them all, and you look at each one individual, and then you say, well, those are toys. The toys then becomes an abstraction because it's a general concept that applies to all of them. And it can just talk about a category or a collection of things that you see. The category becomes an abstraction that it's a help to describe all this. But what makes all this stuff concrete, if you look at each one of them and you see the purpose and the reason why it is there, the reason why it is so colorful, and if you understand the reason what these things are intended to do in order to attract attention of the children and be able to develop some of their capacities and things of that sort, then you have really begun to concretely understand what each of these individual things is.
Right. But you got to think.
My understanding of it. I
think that's very good. You know, the concrete just means grown together, right? It's an organic metaphor, right?
Yeah.
And so something that's grown together organically, each part contributes in its own way to the maintenance of the whole. And so concrete thinking is grasping the functional unity of something such that one understands why it has the parts that it has and which ones are necessary, and then thereby allowing us to distinguish what belongs to it necessarily in order to be the kind of thing that it is from its accidental properties. So on the one hand, we grasp what really belongs to it, and that's the concretion, that's the organic growing together. We see what really, really belongs to get together. And there's also the moment of discrimination. It also allows us to see what doesn't actually belong to this thing in terms of its work, but it's just some kind of accidental property that it has for some historical or whatever reason. So by grasping the unity, we understand which parts belong together and why. And at the same time, we also grasp then what doesn't belong to it in order to be this unity.
Could you also, I don't know if this might not be possible, but you could almost say once you grasp the work of something and once you grasp its function and what it is for and how it is, etc. Could you change that becomes also a very real understanding of it? Use the word real.
Kind of metaphorical, but yeah.
Yeah.
But what it is we have the reality of it, right? Because we understand what the actual thing is. Because we know what belongs together and what doesn't belong together. And as we know, reality is based on the Latin word realitas that comes from res, which just means thing, right? So we found the thingness of it, or the essence of it, that which holds it all together. And in discovering the essence of something, we've discovered its unity, and in discovering its unity, we discover what belongs together in it. And in that, we have the reality of it. And once we have the reality of it, right, we also have the standard for judging. We can now tell what's a defective toy. Why is a defective toy defective, not just another kind of toy, right? Why is a healthy human being the standard by which we judge a sick human being, not the other way around. And if these the reality of something as its essence, as its unity, blah blah blah, is also the internal standard by which we judge what needs improvement and in what direction. So we always grasp what things are with respect to that inner standard. And if we don't have that standard, we can't tell what a bad interpretation is from a good one, right? Or a bad book from a good one, or a bad piece of art, or whatever, or a bad human being, or a bad act from a good one. And so then we make it relative.
Is that internal standard, or that internal understanding of it that we have, that the actual discrimination and the actual cognition of it, is that identical to the universal, or would the universal be somehow some different nuance of that?
I have to think about that just because I don't want to go against Schmidt, and he did give us that section on the primary universal on Aristotle before, and I need to look at that. And but I'm inclined to say, a lot of things are coming together in this ergon, or this this function thing, right? I mean, it's as the unity of the thing, it is its form, but it's also, as its form, it's its purpose, because it's the standard according to which we decide what are good examples of it from defective or immature examples of it, right? So we have purpose, or the final cause and the formal cause and the universal all coming together in this ergon concept. And I just want to make sure I'm not running them together a little bit too much.
Okay.
So I'm going to take a look at that primary universal section that we read a couple months ago. Anyway, we've reached our time. Thanks very much for the concentrated discussion, everybody. Oh yeah, Garth. Yeah, absolutely. Let me, maybe you can rehearse the primary. I'll take a look at that. Maybe I can figure it out. But if there's a question, then maybe we can ask him about it.
Oh boy. Okay, this was good. So what?
Awesome.
We only have one section left to do, or something?
Yeah, we're almost done. All right. So I got to take off, unfortunately, already. But I will try to get some questions out to you. So check your email every once in a while, everybody, and then I'll try to make it not to make it too verbose, so it's not too much work. And then we can get these, and we can discuss them and the last part of the text next week.
Okay. Thank
Well,
you.
bene, sound good?
Thank you.
Thanks
See
so
you
much,
all.
everybody. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.